The shop was old. It smelled of dust and time. Thomas, a young writer seeking inspiration, stepped inside. He loved old things, things with stories. The shopkeeper, a man with eyes as old as the shop, nodded from behind a pile of books. "Looking for something specific," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves. Thomas shook his head. "Just browsing," he murmured, already captivated. Something shimmered in the dim light. Tucked between a grandfather clock and a chipped porcelain doll stood a mirror. It was ornate, framed in tarnished silver. The glass, however, was what drew him in. It seemed to hold a depth he'd never seen in a mirror before. Thomas approached the mirror, his reflection hazy at first. He raised a hand, running it along the cool, smooth surface of the frame. As he leaned closer, his reflection sharpened, but something wasn't right. His reflection was a beat behind. He moved his hand again, watching as the mirrored image lagged. A chill ran down his spine. It was subtle, this delay, barely noticeable. He stepped back, heart pounding, but the strangeness of the mirror, its antique beauty, held him captive. "Interesting, isn't it?" The shopkeeper's voice startled him. "That mirror. It holds a bit of the past," he said, his gaze distant. Thomas swallowed hard. "The past," he echoed, already knowing he wouldn't leave without it. He installed the mirror in his study. At first it was just the lagging reflection, unsettling but almost amusing. He'd catch it sometimes out of the corner of his eye. Then, one evening, as he frowned at a blank page, he saw it. His reflection smiled. It was a slow, creeping smile that didn't reach its eyes. Thomas froze, his blood turning to ice. The smile lingered, then faded as quickly as it had appeared. He stumbled back, knocking over his chair in his haste to get away from the mirror. Sleep was a fleeting visitor now. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that eerie, disembodied smile. The nights were the worst. He'd hear noises, soft whispers coming from the study. He told himself it was the old house settling, but deep down, he knew better. One night, he woke to the distinct feeling of being watched. A sliver of moonlight cut through his curtains, illuminating the mirror across the room. It hummed with a faint, ethereal glow. He couldn't tear his gaze away. Section 6. The reflection moves. And then his reflection moved. It reached out, its hand pressing against the surface of the mirror. Thomas flinched, pressing himself back against the headboard. He blinked, but the image remained. His reflection was no longer a reflection. It was an entity of its own, trapped behind the glass. He watched, paralyzed with fear, as the reflection's lips moved, forming words he couldn't hear. The whisperings grew louder, morphing into a low, guttural growl. He had to get out of there. He had to escape. Section 7. Trapped. But something held him there. An invisible force seemed to root him to the spot. His heart pounded against his ribs, each beat echoing the growing menace in the mirror. His reflection moved again, its body contorting in an impossible way as it tried to break free. He squeezed his eyes shut, unable to bear the sight any longer. The growling intensified, vibrating through him, through the room, through the house. It felt like an eternity passed. Or maybe it was just a minute. Time seemed to warp and distort in the grip of his terror. Section 8. Where is the reflection? Finally silence. He cautiously opened his eyes. The mirror was dark, empty. His reflection was gone. He stumbled out of bed, his legs shaking, and flicked on the bedside lamp. The sudden burst of light did little to chase away the lingering dread. He stared at the empty mirror. Where had it gone? A cold sweat clung to him. He knew, deep in his gut, that this wasn't over. The silence wasn't a comfort. It was a prelude. He just knew it. Section 9. Behind you. He spun around, a scream building in his throat. Standing in the doorway, bathed in the pale light of dawn, creeping through the window, was his reflection. It was no longer a prisoner of the mirror. It was here in his world, and it was smiling. This time the smile reached its eyes.